Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Web Union, and in this one, we start out in the Kherson-Dnieper River area, where we see that the Russians have captured the remaining parts of this island in between the Russian and Ukrainian side of the Kherson River. We see that the Russians continue their offensive operations here in this direction, following accumulated footage of them being present on this northern island. It has become clear that they now completely control it. We see that it's likely due to the Ukrainians withdrawing from their positions within it or having very little presence within it ahead of this Russian assault. The Ukrainians generally withdrew from the majority of their presence here along the Dnieper River following the start of the Kursk offensive, where they relocated forces from the Kherson direction to the south, east, and north. In the Kurakhove section of the front line, the Russians have moved on to capture the fields north of Krasnoyarivka, as well as the western parts of the suburbs, leaving only a tiny part of Krasnoyarivka remaining in Ukrainian hands. This means that 99% of Krasnoyarivka is under Russian control, with just 3 streets remaining under Ukrainian control in the suburbs west of the city. This is taking place as the Ukrainians have continued their withdrawal from the major pocket here in between Krasnoyarivka and Karelivka. The Ukrainians are now by the Volkhya River line, where they have a little to no presence in the remaining parts of the pocket itself. It is likely that the Ukrainians will continue withdrawing beyond the Volkhya River line and south of the reservoir to get better positions, as the Russians are now pressing the Ukrainians in the southern bank of the reservoir, which could be a flanking maneuver towards the Ukrainian presence in the northern parts here to the east of the Volkhya River line, combined with a strike from the Russian positions north of Hrynik towards the northeastern outskirts of Hrynik and then down to connect the two sides, would be devastating for the Ukrainian fortified positions here to the east of Hrynik and generally along the Volkhya River line and the eastern bank of it. Therefore, any attempts by the Ukrainians to withdraw further would be reasonable towards Hrynik and Kurakhivka here in the south, which would leave this entire area under Russian control. The recent advances by the Russians and the withdrawal of the Ukrainians from this pocket has meant that the battle over the Donetsk city and the vicinity of it has ended, and the Battle of Kurakhove begins. In the New York section of the front line, the Russians counterattacked to recapture the northern parts of New York and regain a position in Nilipivka, where they have regained a foothold and are fighting against the 12th Azov Brigade. The 12th Azov Brigade arrived to fight against the Russians and counterattack in the New York direction to fray the Ukrainian soldiers stuck within the industrial zone. We started out with a Ukrainian counterattack to push the Russians out of Nilipivka and gain a foothold in the northeastern parts of New York. The Russians then counterattacked to regain a foothold within Nilipivka and secure the northern parts of New York. It is likely that the Ukrainians will continue these counterattacks in the western parts to open up the area here and secure the northwestern parts, as they have already done once, because the concentration of forces in the northwestern parts is more scarce than the northeastern parts, because in the eastern direction it is well connected to Orlivka and other sections of the Russian positions, which are easy to supply. In the western parts, it is closer to the Ukrainian front line, and the Russian positions there are weaker. Therefore, it's likely that the Ukrainians will focus more on the western parts than the eastern parts to open up this road here northwest of the industrial area. So we'll see heavy fighting here in the northwestern parts rather than the eastern parts. The Battle of New York has most certainly not ended, as the Ukrainians sent additional reinforcements to this direction to fight over it. Further north in the direction of Nevsky and Novosedove, the Russians are continuing offensive operations along the fields here to the east of the Serebets River line. We see that the Russians, ever since they secured the Makiivka village here along the Serebets River line, they have been pushing positional fighting here to the east of Serebets River line along the entirety of the area. We see that they're already close to Yampolivka and Terny in the central parts, so they're pushing in the northern parts. This indicates that the Russians will continue offensive operations along the fields until they get close to the Serebets River line, potentially moving in a southern direction along the river line to capture village after village on the eastern bank. This is slow positional fighting, as it is not prioritized in General. The number one priority of the Russians right now is the Donetsk section of the front line, where they are fighting in the direction of Kharkov, Pokrovsk, New York, Toretsk, and Chasiv Yar. These are the 5 most important sections of the front line for the Russians. The Russians are unlikely to prioritize Liman before the full capture of Pokrovsk, as that would secure the southern parts of the Donetsk region for the Russians, this section here, after which the Russians will push towards Kramatorsk from the western flank. This would need a push towards Liman to gain control of that to secure the northern flank of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. This would mean that the Russians would look to encircle the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line from the north and from the south. Therefore, it's likely that the Russians are in full focus of Pokrovsk and Kharkov to the south, after which they'll move in a northern direction, redirect their forces to the east, and engage in offensive operations there, to then gain full control over the Donetsk region through an encirclement of their strongest defensive line, and then push onwards towards the Dnipro direction to flank the Ukrainian fortified positions in the Zaporizhia section of the front line, or potentially move in the northern direction towards the flank of Kharkiv. In either case, the Russians will just continue their offensive operations in the south and the east, while Kursk is just a secondary priority where they are going to do some positional fighting, but their plan, their strategy to kick the Ukrainians out of the Kursk region is to continue offensive operations in the south and in the east, and even double down with these offensive operations to force the Ukrainians to withdraw out of their own village from the Sumy region, as they would be needed to send their units operating in the Kursk region to other sections to stabilize the front. In the direction of Stelmahivka, the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians further back in the eastern bank of the Serbets River line. The Ukrainians still have positions within Stelmahivka in the northern parts, as well as in the northeastern parts, which the Russians are fighting again from the east head-on. They already held positions on the western bank of the river line. However, the Ukrainian positions here are very strong. Therefore, it is only positional. It's not really a steadfast control over the area. They could be pushed back, similar to the north of Tabaivka. We see that the Russians are here attempting to gain full control of the eastern bank of the Serbets River line, which will secure their flanks and then allow them to push either in the direction of Losova to the west or to strengthen their positions in the north. In the Kursk section of the front line, the Russian and Ukrainian forces continue positional fighting, but we do see 2 Russian advances in this update, one to the east of Koronevo, which is located with this footage here, showing them pushing out east of Koronevo. This is to secure the town further, and this shows the complete Ukrainian defeat in the Battle of Koronevo, which they tried to fight over for a long time. They tried directly storming it head-on, even trying to cross the bridge in the center, where they were hit by heavy artillery. In the north, they attempted to flank by hitting the railway, but they failed as well. Since then, the Russians have done some few counterattacks, positional fighting, which has secured the eastern parts. A lot of people were talking about the river crossings, the Ukrainians were hitting them, and that it would mean the Russians lose the entire area as they were 3,000 soldiers in circle and so on. But so far we're seeing absolutely no changes to this section of the front line, and this is likely due to the fact that the Russians won the bridge war, in the sense that whenever the Ukrainians would hit one of the bridges, they would rebuild it and place a new pontoon bridge and so on. This led to the Ukrainians continuously striking these bridges, but this also meant that their HIMARS systems, which they were using to launch these attacks, would be exposed, together with the air defense, and that ended up causing a lot of losses for the Ukrainian heavy equipment, such as the HIMARS systems. And this has led to the Ukrainians saving the ones that remain from this and deciding that this was not worth it, as they would lose too many HIMARS systems in the process, and therefore now we don't see any more footage of these bridges being blown, and the Russians have simply resupplied these forces through the pontoon bridges. And this has led to this section of the front line being a well-fortified direction, where despite the lack of connection with Koronevo to the east, there is no supply issue with the Russian forces here, and the Ukrainians would use too many soldiers to capture it to be worth it. Therefore, they're now focusing in the northern and eastern parts of the section of the front line, and the Russians are here counterattacking as well, re-entering Cherkansho, Poreshno, where heavy fighting continues as of this moment. So we see that in the Kursk section of the front line, the Ukrainians have really lost much of their steam. We do not expect much more of these major advances. It will likely be a case where the Ukrainians will be stuck between whether they should double down on this offensive or pull out their forces. And now that they have relocated a lot of their reserves from this section to the eastern and southern section of the front line, it is likely that this Kursk offensive is short-lived and will not last for much longer. Instead, the Kursk offensive may turn into the Sumy offensive. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.